We are live.
Cool. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in to this presentation from. We're going to get started in a few minutes. We're just trying to make sure everyone gets comfortable. Go ahead. I know it's a lunch and learn, so grab your lunch, get ready. We're going to have fun. If you're in St. Louis, I know it's a great day, but we're going to have as much fun as we can. If you're not aware, we are live streaming on Facebook. So if you want to visit us, just check out PRSA St. Louis on Facebook. Go ahead and join us. And again, so a little bit about me. My name is Samantha Williams. I'm the Chief Diversity Chair of the Public Relations Society of America St. Louis chapter. And we're very excited to give you a presentation about why visual representation matters. I know we've heard a lot about diversity and inclusion in the past couple of years, but we're going to learn today, what does that mean, especially in photos, and why sometimes we might overlook the most important things to the community. So again, just in a couple minutes, we're going to let everyone get settled in and we'll get started. So as we're waiting, we're going to do a little housekeeping. So today, one thing I want you to remember is you can communicate with me via chat. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, just go ahead and put them in the chat box. We'll check them towards the end of the presentation. I'll try to give you about 30 minutes to 40 minutes about learning, and then we'll open it up for a warm discussion towards the end. Again, we're on Facebook live streaming. You can communicate with us there too. So whether you're with us directly or you're with us on Facebook, we're here and we're ready to teach a little bit about visual communications. So we'll get started. So thank you so much for joining me again. So the first thing I want you to remember is the subject matter is so much more important than the photographer. One of my favorite photographers, Gordon Parks, said this. So what does this mean as a visual communicator? What that means is my lens, my story, my preferences are not more important than subject matter, So I can sometimes unconsciously bring my own bias or my own story into a photo shoot or into a visual marketing piece without even realizing it. And so I need to make sure that the audience that's receiving that visual material is put first and foremost. And so how do we do this? One of my favorite stories is when I was young, I was an intern for the Illinois State Senate. I was learning about visual communication. I had my first big assignment to go up to Chicago and take photos of this huge public hearing that the Senate president was going to be in attendance. And I did all this studying. I learned about composition, color, photo, lighting. I took a lot of notes. I studied under a few photographers that couldn't attend the hearing. I packed up my equipment, went to Chicago, took lots and lots of photos. I was excited. I took photos of everybody that was on the panel. And in particular, it was this one animated gentleman. And when I tell you I took like 200 photos of him, so I thought I did a really great job. I was like, okay, I'm going to be excited. I'm going to take this back to Craig. He's going to see that I was able to do my job as an intern. One problem. Craig quickly noticed that out of the photos, I tended to focus on the animated gentleman who was speaking. The gentleman was the head of a huge union in Chicago, and the photos looked like pretty much any Saturday Night Live skit of a union boss. So I didn't realize it, but I had an unconscious bias, and I accidentally took a story or took a photo that perpetuated some stereotypes that we might see of individuals. And again, even though that was not my intention, even though I come from a union background, in my head, I was just looking at it like, hey, this guy is animated. I think this will create a dynamic photo, but I needed to pay attention to the story. And my assignment was to go there and take photos of a fight that was between the unions and the lawmakers. So again, it just didn't lend to the story that we were trying to tell. So I start with that example to say you can have the best intentions, the best training, and you can still make mistakes. So why does visual storytelling matters? It matters because in this day and age, photos, videos matters way more than words. When's the last time you sat there and read a long article? Probably not that often. So How do we make sure we're being diverse and inclusive in our photos, in our videos? The first thing is to remember what diversity and inclusion means. To me, diversity means inviting everyone to the room. Inclusion means allowing everyone to plan the party, to have a voice, to be heard, to be integrated in the process from the very beginning. But how does this relate to visual storytelling? You need to be diverse and inclusive throughout the entire process of selecting photos and taking photos. You need to have the ability to spot your unconscious bias in yourself and your organization and learn, is it me or is it the photo? And if it's the photo, what are the tools that I need to make sure I don't have this happen again? So first I want to test you. And again, feel free to engage in the chat or on Facebook Live. And again, we'll get to it towards the end of the presentation, but I want to hear from you. I want to test your knowledge. Look at these two photos and I want you to tell me, what do you see that's similar in both of the photos? I'll give you a minute. So on the left, look at that photo. On the right, look at that photo. What's similar? We'll start with the similarities, okay? So what's similar is you see two groups of coworkers working on a project, right? They're all happy, they're smiling, they're collaborating. Now, what do we see that's different? Again, I'll give you a second to look at both photos before I give you the answer, okay? For some people, it may stand out, for some, it may not. So the one thing that stood out for me is if you look in the photo on the right, you have a group of coworkers, you have two men, two women, right? Well, there's something a little wrong with this photo, right? So the man of color, the gentleman of color, is not wearing what I would consider westernized business casual attire. But in the photo on the left, he is. So again, selecting a photo like this, to be honest, the gentleman on the right probably would have never worn that to work. And if that kind of stood out to you, then I give you an A. If it didn't, don't worry, we'll get there. Let's try it again. Let's look at the photo on the left and the photo on the right. What do we see that's similar and what do we see that's different? I'll give you a second to kind of look them over. Okay, now that you kind of look them over, let's point the obvious, right? So the obvious that's similar is you have women drinking water or pouring water or, interacting with water. Everyone's smiling in the photos. Again, I wouldn't necessarily say that the photo on the left is the worst photo I've ever seen, but it's not the best. Depending on your audience, someone could view this as the lady serving the water to the other two people in the photo. Some people could view it as two parents with their children. The photo can change depending on the audience, how they read that photo. The other thing is if you look at the photo on your right, she's smiling, the water is the focus of the story. It looks authentic, she's happy. If you notice something and you're a person of color, you're especially going to notice this, look at their hair. Their hair is a little different, and we'll get to why that happens. So one of the things that happens as communicators, we go to Google, we're on a deadline, we need a photo, we put in, okay, I need a photo of a pilot. So I put in pilot stock photo. What happens? Do you kind of notice what happened? So for me growing up, when I thought of a pilot, I thought of Top Gun. I thought about Tom Cruise and that infamous movie. And guess what? So did Google. So if you look at these photos, you can only spot two women and only one person of color who happens to be a woman. And as we know, there's Tuskegee Airmen, there's Amelia Earhart. We know that there have been many people of color that have been pilots. We know there have been many women that have been pilots. But if we just do a quick photo search without doing any auditing, without doing any deep dive, we could get lazy and just select the first photo we see and say we're good to go. So how did we get here? How did these photos get here? One of the things to keep in mind is that when you go to some of the premier stock image websites, they do not vet their photos, or at least they did until people start calling them out. So what would happen is a photographer would go ahead, take photos, they would set up the photo shoot and they would upload it to Getty's Image or Adobe Photo Stock or Google Image, and that's it. They can tag the photo however they want to. So if I'm a photographer and I'm not doing any deep thinking and I see someone with a tan complexion, I could label them as Middle Eastern. I could label them as Latino. I could label them as multiracial, when in reality, they could be just black and white. So the point is, do not rely just on your photo searches, audit that. So something to keep in mind is that models of color, they face a lot of problems. There's poor photo shoot concepts. The lighting is usually improper. Look at Naomi Campbell here. We all know she's one of the most beautiful women in the world. And the first thing any woman would say looking at this photo is, girl, why does her makeup not match? Well, let's look at the 90s. In the 90s, there was not makeup that matched people of color. There was not lighting that was appropriate for people of color. Um, People didn't know how to do our hair. They still don't. And so a lot of times the models that show up to photo shoots have to do their own hair, or they have to suffer hair damage. So these are things that happen before the subject matters even get in front of the lens and before that photo's taken. So as a communicator of color, you may not even know all this is happening. So again, let's do a deep dive of photography. Let's look at the unconscious bias that has been in the history of photography. It goes all the way back to the 1940s. In the 1940s, Kodak developed a system to calibrate the colors from the negatives that customers gave them from photos. And so, back in the day when you used to take your photo to like Walgreens and get it developed, Kodak was doing that. The only issue is in the 1950s, they used an employee named Shirley Page to calibrate all their equipment to adjust the colors to. If you look on the slide, you'll see a picture of Shirley Page. Very beautiful young lady. Only problem is she's a woman who's white. So it wasn't until the 1960s when chocolate companies like Hershey and furniture companies realized when they went to take a picture of a milk chocolate bar versus a dark chocolate bar or cherry wood versus oak, the cameras were doing something a little funny. They couldn't tell the difference. And so these companies rallied together and they contacted Kodak and said, hey, we have a problem. I need to sell my chocolate bars and I need to be able to tell the difference between milk chocolate and dark chocolate. So this indirectly created the first film for people of color. Yeah, we got lights for us just because of chocolate bars. So Kodak kind of took a step back, and in the 1970s, they were like, okay, there's some problems going on. They thought they resolved their issues by creating the cameras for the chocolate bars. And then photographers realized when we started integrating as a society and models of color was next to non-people of color, they realized that the photo ended up either underexposed or overexposed. And so Kodak tried to address this by the multiracial Shirley card. You might be asking yourself, okay, Sam, how is all of this important to me as a communicator? It's very important because if you're using older photos or if you're trying to use equipment or if you're trying to create a story, you might not even know all this goes into stock photos. You might not even realize that these are problems that people of color face. And if people of color are facing this silently, then you're already starting with stock photos and materials that are biased. So again, it wasn't until the 1990s when Oprah Winfrey and BET teamed together to challenge the industry. If you're a person of color and you were born in, before the 90s and you used to watch Oprah like I did, you notice that our favorite guests of color like Denzel Washington, Naomi Campbell, they looked a little different on Oprah. They looked more vibrant, they looked healthier, they looked happier, they looked better. And that is because Oprah challenged the industry to create equipment and lighting and technology to appropriately take our photos. And so that led us to the equipment that we have today. She is still known for having the best lights and the best equipment in the industry. In the 2000s to present, we have the digital revolution. So that kind of got rid of the Shirley card, but it created another problem, Photoshop. Photoshop sometimes, when used incorrectly, people can overlighten people of color. And so you want to be very aware of that. So now that we've kind of pointed out the history of unconscious bias in photography, especially stock photos, what can we do about it? We as communicators can acknowledge, audit, and be aware. So acknowledge your own personal biases. Do I favor one thing over the other? Am I more aware of one topic than another? Am I used to every part of my city or my community? Do I know what people care about? Do I know the images that resonate with them? Also, check your own organization's biases. You might be able to spot these things, but your organization can't. Do an internal audit. Audit pre-existing materials. It's never too late to go back and refresh old materials or to make sure you're not reusing stock photos that may be problematic. Be aware, be critical of those photos. We just saw how a quick Google search of pilot showed us men that look like Tom Cruise. What you can also do is create, consider, and consult. Create a demographic list that considers different genders, races, abilities, socioeconomic status. And again, that might be hard. How can I depict socioeconomic status? We'll get there. Consider your audience. Who's going to look at these materials? Also, keep in mind that even if you're targeting different audiences, if it's in the public sphere, people can notice that marketing material. I've had this happen to me. We created marketing materials that were supposed to be for people of color and aimed in communities that were predominantly people of color. And then we created materials that were for suburban areas that didn't have as many people of color. And guess what? The organizations that we went to try to help people of color enroll in tech coding in a previous job, they saw those other marketing materials. So you want to be careful and make sure you're not over targeting. You know, people of color should be in materials that's not just for the NAACP. Also, consult. If you don't know, ask and be honest about it. Do your market research just like you would for any written communication. Include people in your organization. Ask experts. You can reach out to other people and say, like, hey, how does this look? And one thing I wanted to do, I was very subconscious, you know, I was very slick with this. So I want to see if you were paying attention today. Did you notice that picture in the previous slide? In the previous slide, it was a picture of a white male on a laptop that was closer to the frame, you know, to the lens. And then the people of color and minorities were further in the back. Now, at first glance, that could look like a decent photo, but you want to be aware of the story that you're telling. And I included that photo to see if you could test your own bias and if you could have raised any red flags without me saying it. In this photo on this slide, I want you to pay attention to the composition. We have 3 individuals, 1 male, 2 women, 1 person of color. In this, you see that you have a male that's a nurse. Again, remember when we looked up pilot, we only saw men that were pilots. There are men that are nurses. And I see people getting very active in the chat. Keep them coming. Keep the questions coming. We're going to get there. So again, if you're joining us on Facebook Live, keep the comments coming. If you're in the chat, we'll get there as well. Now, what can I do? We pointed out the problem. Now, what's the solution? The solution is being very inclusive in your photography. And it all starts with the concept and the prep work. So make sure the photo shoot location prior to shooting is accessible. I'm never going to forget this again. When I was in Illinois, I just learned so much about visual communication. We had about 200 elected officials. We had this famous stairwell, and we had the elected officials line up for a photo. There was one problem. One elected official was in a wheelchair. So what ended up happening was you had 200 elected officials standing on the stairs, and there was no way to integrate the elected official in a wheelchair in a authentic or seamless manner. So what ended up happening was that particular elected official had to be on the front, and it looked a little awkward. So keep all that in mind. You want to make sure that any photo locations you have is going to be inclusive, that anybody can access it. Another thing that as women, we notice this, but men, you may not be aware, always tell your models or your subject matter, where are you going to take a photo? How many times, women, have we been to a photo shoot? We think it's going to be on solid ground, and then the photographer is like, hey, the lighting's great, let's go in the grass. If you're wearing heels, you're going to sink in the grass, and it's just a nightmare. So make sure that you always alert your subject matters about the photo shoot and the location. Make sure you have changes of clothes. Make sure they have comfortable shoes. If they need touch-ups of makeup, or if you need to shine shoes, make sure also you bring a just-in-case kit. So whenever I take photos, especially of elected officials, I have a just-in-case kit. I had one elected official who used to mess with me. He said, Sam, do you always wait till I wear this particular tie to take photos? Did you know all of my marketing materials have the same tie in the photo? And for me, that wasn't something I paid attention to, but for him, he was sensitive about that. So moving forward, I always gave him a week's notice to say, hey, Senator, just letting you know we're going to take photos on Friday. You may want to pack a few ties. So small things like that is going to help. Make sure your lighting equipment is prepared for all people of different backgrounds and colors, because again, as we learned, just because you have a setup for a non-person of color doesn't mean it'll work for a person of color. Make sure you use hair lights. I intentionally set up my lights today to give you an example of that. If you can see my face, you can see the difference between the lightness and darkness of my hair and the lightness and darkness of my skin complexion. If I was of a darker skin tone, you would still be able to see the difference between my hair and my skin tone. Make sure you use reflective lights and diffusers. What this does is it reveals the complexity of your subject matter's facial features. So as you can see, I don't look flat. You can see a roundness of my face. You can see the highlight of my eyebrow, and you can see my features very clearly. And that's because I've set up my lights today for a person of color, which is myself. I either keep the lighting off of the walls, which I know you can't see it, but I don't have any lighting on the wall. So that way you can see me clearly and I can pop and be vibrant today. Make sure you use varying stages of light to create a more dynamic frame. And again, just keep all this in mind. And as you can see, the photographer did a very great job with this photo that I've used in this slide. You can see how the gentleman is illuminating. He looks hydrated. He's drinking water. He clearly stands out from his background. Another thing to keep in mind is be inclusive of and be conscious of undertones. So I have a warmer undertone. So I have a warmer shade of color on, and I make sure my lights are set for a warmer skin tone. But if I had a cool skin tone, you want to set for that too, because what can happen is, remember that photo of Naomi Campbell where her makeup didn't match? What happens is if you have cool tones with somebody that's warm undertone, it can make them look kind of dead. Think of like casket realness. You don't want to look like you work in a morgue. So balance that lighting and darker skin tones. And if you're shooting a big group of people of different backgrounds and different skin tones, here's a little trick. If you have about 10 people, you look at the lightest person, you look at the darkest person, you look for somebody that's kind of in between of skin tone, set your camera for the person that's kind of in the middle of the skin tone range. And what that does is it allows you in post editing to not have to overlighten or over darken, and it just makes it a little more balanced. The other thing you want to make sure is that when you're in post production, resist the urge of overlighting someone. You see my complexion. I should not look like Kim Kardashian when you're done editing me in the post production. So be very sensitive to that. And lastly, I want to leave you with some inclusive stock photo resources. I dropped them in the chat today. So if you go ahead to that chat box, you'll be able to see them. So throughout my presentation, I intentionally use Google search images, Getty images, and some images from these websites that I provided. So I've broken them down for you by ability, LGBTQIA+, different religious diversity, different people of color. And one thing I didn't touch on that I think is very important, especially right now more than ever, is be very, very sensitive to how you use photos of people. So one thing I would caution you is if you have a brochure for your organization and it says call customer service, people of color should not be only on the page that says customer service. You don't want it to look like the only jobs that a person of color can apply for in your organization are customer service, call rep, or you don't want it to be in supportive positions. You want to be very sensitive when you say payment assistant. You don't only use people of color. You don't only use seniors. You don't only use somebody who may have a different ability. You also want to be aware that you want to challenge yourself, right? You want to break down a lot of the existing biases that are in marketing materials. And I challenge you to start with your organization. For me, I work for a utility. So in the utility industry, a lot of times you may not see technicians, experts, CEOs, scientists as people of color. But why is that? So you want to make sure you do a good job of that. And I feel like in American Water, we do a really good job of that. So just be conscious of that, as you're selecting these photos, as you're using these resources, as you're creating your lighting and making sure everything is great. You don't want to do all this work, have a great photo, and then you only put it on the customer service page. The last thing I'm going to leave you with, which is a personal pet peeve of mine, which I would love to see other people adopt and be conscious of. As someone who grew up in a two-parent household, who's very close to my father and did a lot with my father, it bothers me sometimes in marketing materials when I only see a single mom with her children. So I intentionally picked a photo of a father washing hands with his children. There's a lot of men who are very engaged with their children. And so let's respect them and put those photos in our marketing materials. If you're talking about safety, you don't only have to use a mom and her child. You can use a father and his child, or you can use the entire family and their children. And again, when you're talking about people of color, be very sensitive. Do not only use women of color, especially Black women with only children, because that feeds into certain stereotypes and biases. So just be aware of those things. And I'll give you one more slide. Here's a young boy. Again, if you're doing something fun in children, it doesn't only have to be girls. Boys love gardening too. So I wanted to break down a lot of the stereotypes and check my own bias. And I had my own friends edit this presentation to make sure there weren't any biases that I was leaving in the presentation. And I challenge you to do the same. And last but not least, the most important picture in your organization that tells your story is your organization chart. In this day and age, people want to know, are you walking the walk? So if your company is talking about diversity and inclusion and you're attending rallies and you're going, to in St. Louis, we used to have the Annie Malone parade, or if you're going to, like, let's say the Pride parade, but you don't have people in your organization that are people of color or of different orientations or backgrounds or genders, that speaks louder. So always be aware of that. The picture of your organization is going to say a lot about your company. And I know we're getting close, we're getting close to time. So I want to say thank you. And I want to leave it open for a lively discussion. So don't be shy. Ask me any questions you have. Make sure you join our PRSA St. Louis. Here's our website, Facebook, and Twitter. I want to make sure you're aware of our next big presentation, which I think is going to be really, really exciting. It's called The Color of Communication. It's going to talk about what it's like to be a woman of color in the world of communication. And I invite you to attend. And again, I open it up for questions now.
Okay, Sam, please check your chat box. We have
Okay.
placed 2 questions there for you.
Okay, let me go to the chat. Okay, so I'm looking at the chat. So I have a question that says, but what if the first guy does wear that to work? I don't know what he typically wears. It feels more offensive to me to dismiss a photo based on what the guy is wearing than what he's wearing. So that's a good question. So, I check my own bias. So when I saw that photo, I asked myself, okay, Sam, are you being oversensitive about the photo? So the first thing I did was I Googled Indian American at work, our Indian American photo stock. And it took only 5 minutes, and I actually found the entire photo shoot. And he was the only person wearing garb like that. And in that same photo shoot, it was several photos. And again, I am not of Indian American descent, so I do not know entirely what Indian Americans would wear to work. But I do know when I looked at that photo shoot and I saw everyone else wearing traditional Western business casual attire, it did kind of raise a question. So even if you have a question, it is better to say, okay, well, let me double check. So in that situation, if you do all that, you do that research and you still don't know, it's okay to ask. And that's what I did. So I reached out to a former intern of mine who is of Indian descent. And she's like, no, I don't think he would wear that to work. So again, I can't use one person's opinion to weigh my entire marketing strategy. But again, if something doesn't sit right with you, it is okay to do a deeper dive. It is okay to say, okay, what's going on here and things. So that's a good question. I don't have the perfect answer. But the first thing I will say is if something doesn't sit well with you, do extra research. Go ask somebody. So I did ask somebody that wasn't myself and wasn't of my background. And what I could have done to even audit myself even more, I could have reached out to other people and then see how that marketing material plays. I could do a small test pilot, in a community that has a lot of Indian Americans or people of different backgrounds and see how that communication piece plays. But again, I try to use as an example of something that may not have seemed like a red flag that could be a red flag. So let's see another question. Okay, so the next question I have is Photoshop. Okay, you talk about not changing a person's skin tone or color when editing a photo. How do you avoid that? For example, if you take a photo of a person of color and it happens to be a dark photo and I lighten it, or too light or darken it, am I going to offend the photo subject? So that's a good question. I would say you want to use discretion. I would say first off, make sure the lighting's correct when you take the photo in the beginning. The second thing is use so if you're in Photoshop or I like to use Pixlr. If you want that free 99 version, go to Pixlr pixlr.com. I like to use Pixlr. And so what I do is I go into the curves section and it shows you the lighting and darkness so you can sit around and play with it. So one thing I do to kind of check myself to make sure I'm not overlighting or over darkening a subject matter is I always compare it to the original photo of the person. It's a little harder if they're not famous because it's not like you have 50 photos of the person to reference, but you can reference things. And another thing that I do whenever we take photos of our employees, I ask them, what do you think about the photo? So if I edit a photo, especially of an employee, I then go to the employee after I'm done and say, what do you think about this? That gives them the opportunity to tell me, like, hey, you kind of overlighten me. But one thing I want you to kind of pay attention to when I talk about Photoshop and overlighting or over darkening people, I think one of the most famous examples of this, which got them in so much trouble, was the Time magazine that had OJ Simpson on the cover. So, what Time magazine did was they darkened OJ Simpson when they were talking about his trial. And so, we all know that that's a subtle or not so subtle, darken him, make him look blacker, make him look more like what we have negative connotations of. There were also examples. I think her name is Regina Davis. I can't think right now. There was a actress who noticed that Vogue overlightened her. So Vogue, Elle, a lot of the high fashion magazines that have a lot of predominantly white women in them, they have a bad habit of overlightening people of color where you don't even realize they're people of color. Um, that has happened to people like Serena Williams. So those are extreme examples, but sometimes studying extreme examples will help you realize where the line is. So if you're ever in doubt, if you're able to talk to the subject matter, it's okay to say, hey, like, I did some touch ups on your photo. I just want to make sure, what do you think? What do you think of this end product? And that's a good way to check yourself. So some more questions are coming in. Okay, so another question that came in was the woman in the earlier photo had a bit of natural hair look compared to the darker skinned woman who had a ponytail. You mentioned hair. What did you mean by the hair comment? Okay, so that's a good question. So, hair is a very sensitive subject matter in some cultures. And so, the best way for me to explain this is think about men's fashion. Okay. So for the average woman, we may or may not be able to tell the difference between one black suit and another black suit and another black suit. Like, I love fashion, so I love watching Oscars or the red carpet. And when I hear people talk like, oh my God, did you see Brad Pitt's suit? Even with understanding fashion, I still sometimes cannot tell the difference between one double breasted suit and another. But for men, they can spot that out usually, or like with the example of the elected official, the senator with the tie. So a gentleman who wears ties can notice when a tie is a little too short, right? A woman can tell, if a blouse isn't fitting well or if the heels are a little too high. A person of color can tell if a hairstyle is styled or not. So my hair is styled today. I have a curly hair texture. But if my hair was going in different directions and it wasn't in a styled fashion, and someone took my photo and used that photo, an untrained eye would not realize that's not a style. The other thing is you want to be careful and make sure you have people of different backgrounds and different hairstyles. Like if I'm looking at pictures of women of I'm just trying to think Latin descent, like some have curly hair, some have straighter hair. So you just want to make sure you have photos of people that have different hair types and that you're being very sensitive to that. Let's take a step back further. Like, what if someone prefers, because of religious reasons or different reasons, to be covered up? You want to make sure you're doing that appropriately. Not even having a hairstyle and covering yourself is also equally important. So you just want to be cognizant, and it's okay to say I don't know. And if you don't know, ask somebody. So that's just one thing I wanted to point out about hair is just be aware of that. The other thing I intentionally wear my hair like this today because on teams, if you look at my hair, it's hard sometimes to see the delineation from my poof and my hair. And again, if I was of darker skin complexion. But this sounds crazy. I'm gonna do something a little different here. Do you see by me turning the light? Now you can see this halo around my hair. And so again, that's what we mean by when we say use hair lights, use different settings. And what this does is if I was against a darker background, it would differentiate my face, my hair from the background. So we're getting other questions. What type of lighting do you suggest for lighting for people of color? Again, you just want to make sure when I say lighting, it's the same light, it's just you set it up differently. And so when I used to work with that photographer, Craig, that I told you about, the one when I was an intern and learning under him, what he used to do is whenever we had elected officials to come in, he would get different staffers of different skin tones to come in and he would adjust the lights to us. So we will be living Shelly cards, right? So if I'm taking a photo of someone of lighter complexion, I don't want to blast them with as much light, right? But at the same token, if I'm taking a picture of someone of darker skin tone, you want to be careful how you're placing that light. So for me, my light is, if you follow my eye, it's right here. So you can see where the light is coming from. And that's intentional so that I'm lighting my hair and I'm also lighting my face. It says, I've noticed that there are more African American people being used in media and photos now, but it seems hard to find more Asian and Hispanic people in images. Why is that? So that's a good question. And that's why I gave you links so you can find different people of color. So that's something that we're fighting for. We're fighting for representation of all people of color. And one thing you want to be very cognizant of is I make this joke about McDonald's. They've come a long way now. They've come a long way. But I remember when I was a kid, for whatever reason, Black History Month, you would see all these companies who all of a sudden had commercials with only people of color or mostly people of color. And I used to ask my parents all the time, why don't we see those photos in like December or June or July? And so be very aware that be very careful that when you're selecting photos, are you doing an ad, are you doing a commercial, that you're not only doing it for Latin History Week or Asian Pacific History Month or Pride Month or Black History Month. You want to make sure those faces and voices and stories are being told 365. Okay, we're getting a lot of questions. So yeah, so if you have any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Okay, so I see another one. It says, for service photos, you say, try to avoid using people of color in service photos, serving others, etc. I get that. But service exists and somebody has to be in those photos. How do you rectify that? Again, I'm not saying don't, right? I'm not saying do not use them, right? So I used to work at the St. Louis Zoo. I used to work in different capacities. my statement is that should not be the only place, right? So if I have a 30-page marketing booklet on your company, right? And I'm flipping through, and on the first page I see a scientist, and then on the 10th page I see a CEO, and then I go through and I see an engineer, and then it's only when I get to the payment assistant page or I go to customer service and I see anybody of color, that's a problem. So I would flip it, right? I flip it. I think in this day and age, we've come a long way where we recognize that if you only see a woman in a at house, at home, if you go through a 50-page brochure and then you only see women at home cooking, cleaning, raising children, I think we've come a long way as society where we see that that's a problem. We do understand and recognize there are women CEOs. Like the president of my company is a woman. A lot of the leadership positions in my company at corporate level are women. So I just say how we've come a long way for women in visual communication. We're no longer in those Mad Men era, where you're smoking a cigar and the woman's handing the man the cigar. We need to do the same when it comes to people of color. We need to do the same when it comes to different abilities. Again, don't only use a senior when you're talking about payment assistant, program. So I just want you to be aware of these things. And you can over audit. So I'm not saying rip up all your marketing materials. I'm just saying let's start keeping these things in mind. So okay, and so the second part of this would say at this point I would be afraid to use anything other than a white male. You don't have to, I'm not saying that you don't have to like be afraid. Don't be afraid. Like I said, there's people of color and there's different backgrounds that are in every role. Just make sure you mix it up. So one thing that we do in our company that I think is fantastic is like if we create 10 marketing materials, like maybe on two of them is a person of color. So I'm thinking of my company. We have different brochures that talk about customer service and how to call us and how to reach us. And in one particular handout that I'm thinking of, we use a Black woman who's a customer service rep, and she actually is a real person, a real employee. The second time we use a photo is someone who is of Asian descent, who is a real employee. And then the third handout that we have is a white gentleman who's a real employee. So again, it's not saying you can't use photos. I just want you to be aware, like again, just be aware of some of those stereotypes. The biggest things that we forget is a lot of times our marketing materials is the first thing that a person sees, it's our business card, if you will. And we need to think beyond our customers and think about our consumers. And what do I mean by that? I think about when I was a little child. I used to love Louis the Lightning Bug. I don't know if, some people may know this in St. Louis, but Louis Lightning Bug was like really big in like the 80s, 90s. And so he was teaching people about electricity and they would use the mascot everywhere. And so what I loved about Louis the Lightning Bug is back then when they had advertisements, they showed different colors. Different children of different colors. And so that's something that resonates with me. I couldn't pay electric bill, but I remember Louis the Lightning Bug. So I'm very fond of that image. When I think of St. Louis and Anheuser-Busch and the Clydesdales, I was too young to drink a beer, but I remember the horses. So again, your marketing materials is sending messages out there. So if you worry about am I going too far, don't worry about that. But just always ask yourself, is it too familiar to me? Am I supporting stereotypes that are already out there or am I dismantling them? If you do that quick audit, that'll tell you where you need to be. So if that's pretty much it, I welcome any further questions. But again, please remember to join us. We would love to have you as a member of PRSA St. Louis. I think you'll find it very worthwhile. We're here to support you. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Follow me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to support.
There's two more questions, Sam.
You have two more questions? Okay, let's see. I'm not seeing the questions. Let me see. Are they on Facebook Live?
They're in your chat.
Okay. Okay, just a second, everybody. Okay. How has facial recognition impacted? I'm so glad somebody asked this. You don't even know. You just made my day. Okay, so as a communicator, I'm always teaching myself. I'm always learning. Maybe I'm a nerd, but I just love this. So, like, just last night before this presentation, there was a documentary. I can't remember if it was on Netflix, but it was talking about AI, right? And facial recognition and how there's unconscious biases. And so there was this young Black lady who was doing a project. She was using AI, or artificial intelligence, and she couldn't figure out why her face wasn't being recognized. And so she's a young Black lady. So she tried everything. She thought her coding was wrong. I think she was either at MIT or Harvard. I think Harvard. And so she's doing her coding. She's like, "What's wrong? What's wrong? Why is it not recognizing me?" And then she thought about it, and she's like, "Okay, is it the lighting?" She changed the lighting. She ended up getting a white mask and put the mask over her face, and it recognized the mask. And so what she realized was the code that was fed into the programming had biases. She went and looked at the data set, and all the photos that the engineers used to create the artificial intelligence and facial recognition equipment only used mostly people who were white. It's mostly white men. So it had a really hard time recognizing people of color, especially darker skin tones. And so that is a perfect example of how biases, unconscious biases, seep into our technology. And so when you ask how has this impacted the media industry, it's huge. So think about it, everything from your phone to like security systems to different marketing materials might have a facial recognition program to it. And if it's not checking for these things, if it's not correcting for these things, it can cause a problem. The other thing that I found in that documentary, they said, is when these artificial programs are used, it would discriminate against women, it would discriminate against people of color, like they would weed out resumes of women. So it's a nightmare. So I say that to say, if you are a communicator and you work in the tech industry, especially, you need to be in those top level meetings. You need to be asking questions. That's one thing that we do in American Water. I meet with engineers, and when we're talking about infrastructure and we're talking about investments and we're talking about what we're doing, I ask, like, what's the impact of this? What's the story that we're telling? What are the photos that we're using? How are people responding? If I send a marketing material to a community and I'm not taking this into consideration, it can cause so many problems. So that's a very good question. And I fell asleep on the documentary, full disclosure. So I only remember the first half, but I'm glad somebody pointed that out. Another question is, does St. Louis do a good job with their marketing to be inclusive and diverse? Okay. I can't speak for a city as a whole, but what I can say is I've seen improvements, but we do have a ways to go. I'll take it back to the utility space. One thing that I find when it comes to the sciences, technology, a lot of times, even in that, so I'm trying to be sensitive when I say this. In the tech industry, in the tech space, people of color can fall into almost two categories, right? You might see the phrase BIPOC, that means Black or Indigenous person of color. So you want to be very cognizant of that too. You want to make sure that you're inclusive in the space, right? If I'm talking about certain industries, it may be dominated by different people. If I'm talking about a field that's dominated by women, I need to make sure I'm doing a good job of showing men, like with nurses, like I want to make sure I'm showing male nurses. I say, the commercial that made me happy, I saw on a Verizon, and I just lit up because I was just talking about this with somebody about the utility space and how we need to do a better job of showing people of color and women as scientists. And Verizon had this whole ad, this commercial that showed a Black scientist, it was a woman scientist. It hit every checkbox. And so I would say regionally, we have a way to go, but it's really not the city, it's the organization. So whoever asked this question, I'm so glad you asked it, but the next question we need to ask is, what is my industry doing? Or what is my individual organization doing? And am I leading to progressive change in that industry when it comes to representation? When we look at Southern states, I think they've learned and they're doing a much better job of doing outreach to, let's say, Latino communication, communities. I know in American Water, California American Water, they do an amazing job reaching out to the Latin community. We need to do the same in St. Louis, not just in the utility space, but all over. We need to be aware of the populations in our cities. I think of St. Louis City in specific, and I know there's people on this call that's not from St. Louis, so I'll do the best I can to equate it for you. In St. Louis, we can be very divided sometimes, and we want to make sure, we talk about the Del Mar divide. For those not from St. Louis, I would say it's the equivalent of, if you're on the East Coast, when you think about New York, the different boroughs. Like if I say Manhattan, you might have an image in your head. If I say Staten Island, you might have a different image in your head. If I say Brooklyn, if I say the Bronx, those are all different images. They're all different codes, right? It's the same in St. Louis. When I say North County, West County, South County, the city. When I say the city, if I say North City, South City, already as a communicator, you can kind of get an image of people in your head. And so you want to make sure that your marketing material is hitting all of those diverse backgrounds. You want to make sure if you're communicating, especially in, let's say, South City, where we have different migrant populations, we have different ethnicities, is your material in different languages? Are the stories you're telling going to resonate with those communities? And this is going to sound crazy, but I think this is a good example of cultural communication, which is the next step, is the use of animals. So I used to live in Costa Rica with the host family for a little bit, and their relationship with dogs was not the same as in America. They thought it was almost disrespectful to have an animal in the house. They're like, it's a living, breathing thing. Why am I holding it in captivity? But they love dogs, right? So this is extreme example, but if you work in an organization where you're working in different countries, this presentation today, you want to take that times 10, right? So if I'm working for, let's say, Fleischmann Hillard, or I'm trying to think of global brands, if I'm sending something to Costa Rica and I have someone holding their dog and they're inside and the dog is on a leash, that's not a friendly ad. It might seem warm and fuzzy for me, but in that culture, it may be offensive. So again, it just goes back to research. Just make sure you understand what your targeted audience cares about. Okay, so we have no more questions. So thank you so much for joining. I hope I kept it fun for you today. So again, just last reminder, join PRSA St. Louis. If you're on our Facebook Live, thank you so much. We welcome you to come back next time.